Nemo's, the Tales on the Sand's Spiritual Foundations. Ever since I was a child, I have always been gregarious, and I loved to express my passion of writing and my poetry to others. I began by writing and telling poetry when I was a youth, and I used to entertain my school friends with my creative spontaneity in the sports fields and the play areas in between lessons. I had several poems and short stories published in the school magazine, and I went on to get one published in a local university paper called The Brighton Voice when I was 21. My schooling was not very dynamic for an academic career because it was a dead-end school that was closing down, which was caught up in the turmoil of the transformation from secondary to comprehensive education, and the teachers whose jobs were on the line had no time or patience for anyone. However, I made the most out of it, and I came out with a CSE in English and Geography, which did not give me many options on what line of work to pursue. So I persisted on my writing and hoped that something would come from it, as I felt instinctively or intuitively that that was my life's true path. It was in my early 20s that a whole new world of writing opened up for me, and it came in the form of spontaneous or automatic writing. I would feel a shift in consciousness in the form of a heightened awareness of my five senses, and my voice used to go up a pitch, and you could cut the atmosphere with a knife. When it first happened, I began using it like a psychic doing party tricks, as I told people their middle names, pregnancies in advance, as I told them about social situations and events that I had no way of knowing. However, the most amazing thing for me that it did was when I was working as a night cashier at a local car park, when it told me the correct number of cars that would come out on me in the evening in advance. Basically, it wrote it at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, and when I clocked on at 10 p.m. that evening, the car park was full. Most of the cars were at a conference and they were in for a few days. However, there were cars that were there because the occupants were at a concert, and those cars began to exit the car park at 10:30 p.m. and when they finished exiting, 34 cars came out as the writing predicted. To show me that it was not a coincidence or a fluke, it repeated the prediction the following day. Only this time it wrote 32, and that evening, like before, its prediction was proved correct again. The gig was Chris Rea, and he was at the Brighton Centre for 2 nights, which I did not know in advance, because the major car parks usually contain the cars that go to the gigs in this area. As my park was under a hotel and off the beaten track, and it usually only dealt with customers that stayed at that establishment, lived there parochially, or in the neighbourhood. To put it into perspective, those customers would not begin chaotically looking for a place to park their cars until they were approaching the time of the concert at around 7 that evening, and the writing had told me 2 days in a row at 4 in the afternoon how many cars would decide to park in my car park in advance. Which kind of blows a chaotic or probable worldview out of the water, so to speak. However, I do not think that all our futures are set in stone. But I came to realize that Spirit can and did see into the future on these 2 occasions, or perhaps they guided the potential customers to my car park on those nights, or perhaps we are all guided in life by higher beings to help us reach our decisions. Today I personally believe in free will, determinism, and spirit working together in much the same way as a jazz band's musician does at a concert. For example, some notes that we play are determined from the script. Then you have free will as they drift off into spontaneity, and some are spiritually inspired as they tap into spirit. Nonetheless, because it predicted the number of cars that would come out 2 days in a row, I reached the conclusion that the writing was not subjective or impulsively erupting from my unconsciousness in a Freudian surrealistic cathartic outburst. After a time, I took it more seriously, and I realized that it was channeling so that I could spiritually mature, and I left the parlor tricks behind and I began writing uncommon wisdom. I must stress that I did not see myself as a prophet, a seer or a soothsayer. I was, and I quote William Blake when he described himself doing it, I was just the secretary taking notes, or an interface between the corporeal flesh and the spiritual realms. When it wrote that the universe was the creative mind of God, and that it was a conscious creative energy that was beyond gender, and that it was humankind's destiny to evolve through the spirit and the flesh to reach a level where they would become equal to God and live in eternal matter. But I had no objective facts to give it credence or authenticity. I must specify that at that time in my life, although I believed in spirit, I did not believe in God. I just thought that life was a paradox that I had acquired from the wisdom of the punks and the hippies. On the one hand, you had humanity, which consisted of wealth, power, greed, sex and violence, and on the other you had spirituality, which consisted of love, peace, joy, compassion, social, psychological and spiritual harmonic bliss. God was a concept or hypothesis that was our overlord and creator to help us have faith that there was a higher purpose to life, giving promises of a brighter future and a better tomorrow. Nevertheless, at that time I swayed towards the punks' mindset when they said that at its roots that the church was profiteering, manipulating and controlling the masses by feeding humanity with their false hopes, security and desire. On the whole, I thought that they had made it all up so they could bathe in the profits out of humanity's social constraints and their spiritual needs, and so I decided to look up various forms of religion to see that if under the surface there was more to it than meets the eye, and to see if they had indeed hit on some form of higher wisdom when they were gathering up their coins and wielding their power in the name of God or Jesus Christ. But mainly I was ever the skeptic, for my faith in the writing's authenticity had slipped again, and I wanted to see if it was comparative with what the writing had wrote. To see if it was all mumbo jumbo created out of wish fulfillment emanating from my unconscious mind, or if it was some kind of spiritual force giving me divine wisdom for me to have, hold and cherish. Going forward, with today's perspective, when looking at religion, I can only say that I have read that a few centuries back, that the philosophers of that time suggested that religion was an outdated, expensive, and useless hypothesis. And the government came to the conclusion that they would stop funding it, and that it would have to survive on charity and handouts alone, and they focused their attention on science instead. However, ironically now, with their latest breakthroughs and new understanding of how consciousness affects subatomic particles in the microscopic universe, scientists are finally coming together with philosophy and the Eastern religion's ethos of a return trip from and to God as a handy hypothesis. I think that the Western religions, with their warm, loving and receptive arms, do indeed in this day and age help the lonely, lost and needy. And although they all slightly disagree with each other on whose God is real, and what you should believe in and follow, that on a fundamental level their ethical codes and principles are all basically the same. And I believe that it does not matter what you believe in as long as you do it with love, hope and charity, and that you live your life with virtuosity, respect for oneself, the environment and all life. On the whole, it's not what you believe that is important. It's what you do that is important, and as long as you live a long, fruitful and harmonious life, and see it through an ever-loving, honest, open heart, in my eyes you can do no harm. Coming back, when I researched to see if there were any relative views, I found that in the West that God was seen as an external, creative, supernal male entity, and mainly in the East, the universe itself, which humanity is one with, was seen as God. The Christians in the West believed that we had defied God by eating the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, and because of that God had turned his back on us and cast us out into the wilderness. Then one day part of him came down to earth personified as Jesus Christ, and we betrayed and crucified him on the cross. Ironically, it is said that he planned it that way because he died for our sins, and if we were to recognize that and go on to follow his teachings, that at the end of days he would return and pass judgment by seeing the Holy Spirit that was also part of him emanate from our beings for having that belief. And then the good from the bad would be sorted, and everyone would be distributed into either heaven or hell, according to their having or lacking religious discipline, ethics and faith. I went on to discover that the Gnostics, which were the base root of Christianity, along with other pagan belief structures, saw the progression of the soul, but only up into heaven. They called the physical the imperfect world created by an imperfect God, and heaven as the perfect world created by the perfect God, and it was our destiny to realize this through knowledge and lift out of the former and then into the latter. Then there was the East, where the Tibetan Buddhists believed that at death one will go for a karmic cleansing in the spiritual state, and after the karma was resolved they would go into a pure spiritual state, where they eventually got bored or felt the need to be born again. And so they would physically reincarnate, and they continued on their cyclic spiritual journey. Then you have Taoism, that believed that you come from the Tao, get born into the world, perfect your mind with meditation, and then scribe your life experiences through the senses back into the Tao as you return to God or the Source. Next, you had Hinduism, that saw us as a wave rising from the eternal sea to live one's life experiences, and then return to the eternal sea at death. They are also caught up on a cyclic journey of birth and rebirth, while they are out of sync with the whole, until finally their karma is resolved as they return to a state of love, and they reconnect to the Source or Brahman. Basically, East or West, no one saw humanity becoming gods. It is only now 40 years on that the modern scholars and thinkers alike are beginning to think this way about God, and us progressing on through spirit to become equal to our gods. It wrote that in the future that we would find the cure to AIDS and cancer, and for a long time I questioned that. But now they not only have drugs that take away the fatality of AIDS, but just recently they have made a groundbreaking advancement in our fight against blood cancer by extracting the killer T cells from the immune system and then genetically modifying them to recognize and attack the cancer cells and destroy them when they are reintroduced back into the body. There has also recently been a breakthrough with prostate cancer by injecting seaweed into it to bring it to remission. It was at this time of my life that I decided that with this spiritual database in my grasp, that I could write a book and perhaps bring forth a different perspective of spiritual literature from the writing's notion on life, life after life, God and heaven. Still, before I could begin to write that book, I had to go back to school so I could break free from my subjectivity and give it objectivity or lucidity, because as I say at that time I did not fully understand anything to do with deep thought, spiritual philosophy or metaphysics. All I knew was that this strange wisdom that the writing had given me had compelled me to have the impetus and the need to learn and know more about the aforementioned literature, or the spiritual ethos or theosophy. My journey began by going back to school to learn the basics, and at home reading of good versus evil in the popular horror novels that became available to me to give me solid foundations to begin my search to create my unconventional neo-philosophy. As I say, I decided to start with the basics, so I went to a few free classes at the Friends Center to make up for my poor education, to bring me up to scratch with the rest of the world. I did it in between gardening jobs in my mid-20s, and I did maths, English, creative writing in the classroom, and I also gained some computer skills studying on a BBC computer. I loved all the subjects, but I was totally awestruck by the word processing writing package in the latter. I loved the ability to do the grammar check, the cut and paste, and last, but not least, the spell check on the computer. I wasn't that good at spelling because of my adverse or non-existent secondary education, but I was an avid reader. So I could recognize the words and I corrected them myself, when I was given the multiple choice that was presented to me with the spell check revealing my spelling errors on the screen, and this combined with my creative writing skills. I was soon soaring to untold heights and loving the view. Backtracking. Even though I was not academically educated, I loved to read for pleasure, and I began by reading Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, The Lion, The Witch and the Wardrobe and Gulliver's Travels when I was 11 years of age. I read parapsychology and books on the paranormal in my early and mid-teens, and Sven Hassel's war stories and Jackie Collins's scandalous books in my late teens and early 20s. And I got into popular horror novels in my mid-20s, because as I said, the writing had inspired me to read mysticism, and that was the closest that I was capable of coming to mysticism at that time. Basically, with fiction you passively take in the stories, whereas with deep thought and philosophy you become active as you read, then question the literature, and at that time I was not up to that kind of standard and I didn't possess those abilities. I read the novels all the way up until I was 28, and when I landed a job as a night cashier in a local car park, I had read all the horror books that I could find that roused an interest in me. When I reached that stage, my partner at the time suggested that I should read whatever was in those books that drove me to read them. So I took her advice, and it reawoke that spark that the automatic writing had lit, and I realized that I was now ready to leave the world of fiction behind, and I went on to read non-fiction in its place instead. I soon began to read philosophy, religion, psychology, science, and above all else books on spirit, and I still read them up to the present day. I also attended every, although not academic, night school lesson in several colleges that I could find on esoteric and metaphysical subjects right up to my mid-30s, along with astrophysics, psychology, Eastern philosophy, and spiritual disciplines and practices, and even in the present day I use the internet with the utilization of Google and YouTube. Basically, I went wherever my heart or path would lead me. However, all that being said, my real education began with the reading of punk lyrics in the late 1970s, and they not only woke me up politically with their rebellious rage, but they also got me to think about things and also to value and to start keeping hold of my own thoughts, short stories, and my poems. By the end of the 1970s, the spirit of punk had evolved into new wave, goth, futurism, and the new romantics, who expressed themselves through fashion, music, art, and glamour, and this also had a major influence on my mindset at the time. When the mid-80s came around, because I didn't like the contemporary music of that time, I decided to form my own band called Nemo. Then, with the resurgence and influence of the psychedelic culture, I developed spiritually with acts of shamanism when I practiced or jammed with my band and in live performances, and this was again reflected in my lyrics and literature up until the late 1990s. Ever since Socrates right on through to Gurdjieff and beyond, there have been seekers of truth and wisdom. So it seems that humankind loves to toy with their intellectualism to weigh up subjects such as love, the existence of the soul, the hereafter, and our individual and joint soul purpose, where we serve our God. Backtracking. In my mid-20s on through to my late 30s, my partner of that time and I attended various afternoon and evening college courses to do with spirit wisdom and deep thought. And at the same time we accumulated and voraciously read many books on the same subjects that soon began to affect and sculpture our personalities, emotions, characters, and our souls. After a while, the people that we met through the college courses and through serendipity in the streets that we intellectualized with, the former, the college lesson subjects, and the latter, on the books that we had read, that they soon became friends, companions, and our intellectual associates. There was one problem though, and that was although that we could talk in between lessons in the street, or in a public house, or cafe, we could not be totally relaxed and satisfied. So it was not long before my partner and I began to hold a series of intellectual and spiritual parties of our own at our flat, where we would all sit about on the floor on yoga cushions, consuming various psychedelic triggers, as we discussed the aforementioned topics. As time went by, the parties seemed to take on a life of their own, as the friends and associates started to bring along friends and friends of friends with the same social, intellectual and spiritual interests and prowess from other colleges, universities, suburbia, the streets, or other populated places, and other social surroundings, and the parties grew in prestige and number. After reading all the books, attending all the college lessons and the parties, my wisdom grew, and I rekindled and reinforced the truth that the automatic writing was real, and that some, but not all of it, could be seen as objective, and it began to inspire and influence my own writing. Yes, I had finally reached a plateau, where my normal writing was on par with the automatic writing's wisdom, and I took on a more serious role, and I began to write about all the above-mentioned literature and subjects in my own original way. But it was not until I was 42 that my writing took on a more New Age Gnostic approach and or flavor, and everything fell into place both psychologically and spiritually. It was around this time that the channeling took on a different route, as it stopped coming through to me consciously in automatic writing. I think that all the reading, studying and analyzing overstimulated my left brain, and that my right spiritual brain became less active. So it began manifesting itself subconsciously in vivid spiritual dream states, when my right brain was active and my left brain was less predominant. There were dreams where I would see spiritual beings that would give me spiritual messages, or short stories that were so compelling that I would wake up and then interpret them with my left brain by adding a little research, and then write them down on my computer. It is well documented that we often have spiritual experiences as we drift off into or drift out of sleep, like Paul McCartney did with Yesterday, Mary Shelley did with Frankenstein, or James Watson did when he dreamt of the DNA's double helix the night before he delivered it. And to back this up, the scientists declare that their experiments are initiated by their miracles, or what spiritualists call their intuition or spiritual divination. Finally, at 62, I discovered through YouTube that the modern-day scientific mathematicians and philosophers were one step away from the writing's philosophy, as I discovered that Donald Hoffman's conscious realism and Philip Goff's panpsychism were almost synonymous with the automatic writing's wisdom. The only difference was the afterlife ethos. Basically, the former states that one returns to the source at death, as life is naught but losing oneself in the play or the game show, whilst gazing through the interface, or in Donald's own words, the headset, where one is totally engrossed into the illusion of life, and the point to life was to live in the now, compete, communicate, and enjoy the game as God uncovers and discovers its personality, so it can evolve and rise above humanity. The latter, everything is governed by a universal consciousness, and humanity's consciousness is built up from this, and at death we lose our consciousness, or our personalities, as we are absorbed back into the source. I could plainly see that they were both partially compatible, although diverse on life within the illusion, but they were both in agreement with the Eastern theosophical mindset of that at death one simply returns home and is absorbed by the source. Now I could see that because hypotheses are built on past foundations, that Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society's wisdom had impaired their wisdom with their homecoming ethos, and that God for them was more like the Eastern view of just observing, or in the supernal act of just being, and so they, I believe, misinterpreted their calculations because of this. Ultimately, I think that they will look to nature and see that the ripe apple does not get absorbed back into the tree when it falls. It falls onto the fertile soil, germinates, and eventually becomes a tree that bears its own fruit, and from within the fruit are its seeds, and within the seeds are the seeds of yet tomorrow's seeds, within an infinite eternal flourishing orchard. Proof of heaven. This morning I saw my wife in her astral body, while she was sleeping in the bedroom, as I sat quietly listening to music on my headphones. I noticed that she was wearing a black cape cum poncho, and I was between the two, and so a cape cum poncho will suffice, without too much unnecessary detail. When she aroused from her slumber, I told her of the experience intricately, and we both thought that it was a strange experience, and then we went out to visit a couple of friends at their allotment, and thought nothing more of it. When at the allotment, we were discussing Nietzsche's ethos on the creation of heaven, which he said was created by the slave's weakness and envy of their Roman masters' lives, stating that the Jewish slaves created good and evil and heaven and hell. Mary then said that spirit tells one what one wishes to hear. For example, we are nothing more than the product of one's own conditioning. After leaving the allotment, my wife and I found an abandoned coat on the floor at the bus stop. Which was ironic, for it was a spring-cum-autumn lady's coat that she had been searching for recently online, because she didn't have a coat for those seasons, and the coat's description, would you believe it, was the cape cum poncho from the vision, and we knew it was a synchronicity, and it was for her as it fitted her perfectly, and it looked as if it were new and not second-hand, which was the perfect ending to the astral spiritual visionary experience. And Spirit's way of letting us know that the envious slaves' Christian hypothesis was not only born from their jealousy alone, but also from intuition and divine inspiration. And it was then that I decided that Spirit was telling me that it was guiding me, and that it was time to put my writing into fruition. And so I listened to the Synchronicity's message. And I thought that the mathematicians and philosophers were at the same position of those envious Jewish slaves, only that their inspiration was born from their mathematical calculations and their philosophical assumptions, and acknowledging this, I published the Tales on the Sand and completed my destiny. The Homecoming. The Christians believe that heaven is in Earth's future, and we become immortal and return to Eden, whereas the Catholics believe that you go to a spiritual heaven after death, and you become immortal. In the East they believe that God is within, and one must balance one's karma to become a pure spirit, and are absorbed by God and cease to exist, as one achieves one's ambition or enlightenment and merges with the Creator. When Plato penned the Phaedra, could he have been describing what the modern-day mathematical scientists are unveiling with their mathematical research, their miraculous insights, and their astute observations of the multidimensional particles that appear from particle accelerator experiments? The Christians valued the ancient Greeks' vision on what they called the Phaedra, and they renamed it and they called it heaven, and it was seen as metaphysical and above the clouds. When Galileo, Copernicus, Darwin, and Newton added their scientific slant to the mix, in that consciousness could not be explained within the constraints of mathematical quantities. All humanity loses its importance with the heliocentric hypothesis, or with the true discovery of life's origins and the clockwork universe. That religion was dropped by the intellectual world, and when Francis Bacon proclaimed that knowledge is power, meaning that human nature can overpower nature, and that heaven could be for everyone, as we can create a modern materialistic utopian heaven with the accomplishments of science now on Earth. Nonetheless, science, with their denial of that religion, can only suggest with their spiritual hypotheses what happens to us after death, but it doesn't really matter what you believe follows death, and that they were holding their breaths and wasting their human rights and lives. For if they truly understood the true point of their lives, it was for them to appreciate their very existence, and to set the stage with their intersubjective attainment of enlightenment, with the Occidental God's plan, that what is important is to live life virtuously by valuing and utilizing all God's creation whilst here on the earth. Fundamentally, the universal message of all religions and humanity are all the same, in that they want us all to open our minds and look within to bless the life that we are living, to value and respect that there is one universal love, or consciousness at the heart of all creation and within all living things. And that the universal consciousness that science is discovering within the scientific breakthroughs could lead to the ultimate discovery that we have all come into form from within the newly discovered dimensions to live our lives to the full and then return with the attainment of both worlds. Basically, the unification of both the spirit and the flesh intact as we become immortal gods and adorn heaven at our final spiritual crossover. Ultimately, it is through right living, virtuosity, mindfulness and the attainment of love consciousness on earth that we realize God's precognitive vision of eternal matter, which we all hold dear within our souls, that are at the core of our intersubjective postmodern thoughts and feelings, and that this knowledge once attained are the ticket, or our way back home to heaven. P.S. After I had completed my account of the universe being a conscious extension of itself that has manifested life, so that through conscious organisms, it can add meaning to the existence of the universe by exploring and discovering itself. And that to evolve into a combination of panpsychism and conscious realism for me was the ticket to eternal matter, that I had no final premise to paint a clear picture. Then as I shut down the computer and entered the sitting room, I caught a program on YouTube of a conscious universe being our ultimate reality, and although it was physical and conscious organisms that were seen as the purpose of, or the ultimate ambition of our reality, and that it wasn't really relevant to my research per se. That in its build-up it said that Plato wrote about Socrates and Aristotle that valued a world of ideas, or forms that were perfect in a metaphysical universe above the clouds, that was in a state of timelessness, and the forms that lived there were formless and eternal. And that they had created our imperfect world of substance out of thought, or spirit, and that we were mere shadows of their reality living in an imperfect world. And that the reason for our existence was to transcend our imperfect reality of sin with abstinence, and to ascend to what the Christians, when they adopted it, called heaven. And so with their spiritual ethos, they had realized eternal matter, and my premises leading to a valid argument of realizing eternal matter was finally complete. God is man. Plato believed that we were the shadow of our true selves from the Phaedra, or the perfect world, while on the earth, basically we come from the perfect world where we were whole and integral, and we have carried over within our far memories knowledge from the Phaedra or heaven, the perfect world. Man is God. And with that came his argument that we do not gain knowledge from this imperfect world, we simply recognize the knowledge through meditation, study, contemplation, and our life's experiences, while we are on the earth from the perfect world where we were whole. God is man. We are on a round trip from and to heaven, dropping off at the simulation, planet Earth, to help God discover itself through our interactions, pick up some shopping, have some worldly experiences, do a bit of shopping and find the perfect environments along the way. Ultimately at death, we do not become absorbed back into the whole in a mystical sense, but in a holographic sense. We carry over with us our personalities, values, environments, and our life's experiences at our crossing to add infinite conscious beings, forms, and things to the eternal formlessness, or eternal matter. Whereas individual and one, free immortal spirits, that are as one with all and everything, we all work, rest, and play out our infinite lives happily ever after within the infinite and eternal shores of eternal matter.